Rosh Hashiva, Talmud, Chochem, Tzaddik, absolutely. You have many more titles than me. We have to emphasize it, Damon. Okay, so this for a Shleima for all the Cholim of Klal Yisrael.
Amen.
And continuing with the theme of Eruv Chatzerot. Okay, so for where we left off yesterday, the Eruv is affected by one of the residents called. Okay, actually, we've done that. Okay. If one is the only Jew residing in a block of apartments, one is permitted to carry articles within the whole building, including the shared staircase and hallway. But if other Jews also live in the building, an Eruv must be made with them. If another Jew resides in one's building or precinct, but he is not observant, one cannot make an Eruv with him to permit carrying in the shared areas. For such an agreement cannot be made with someone who doesn't conform to its principles. Instead, one should give him a nominal sum of money or gift and say, "I to me your interest in the hallway for this money or gift." Once accepted, the recipient would be entitled to use the shared area only as a guest, giving the full degree of ownership to the one wishing to carry items on Shabbos within that domain. A similar approach is necessary with regards to each Gentile living in the building or precinct when two or more Jews are proposing an Eruv. Each Gentile must be approached to hire out the interest in the shared part of the property. But if only one Jew resides in the building, this is unnecessary since no Eruv needs to be made, as mentioned above. In this case of such shared areas, it is sufficient to approach the landlord or caretaker rather than each individual Gentile to hire their share. Similarly, when a town Eruv is established, one may approach the mayor or a local government officer. Although these people are not the actual owners, they possess sufficient control over the properties in the area to enable this type of arrangement to be made. And lastly, it is a mitzvah to pursue the opportunity of making an Eruv. The existence of such an arrangement is likely to reduce the occurrence of Chilul Shabbos, or Shabbos desecration. And then it says, okay, well, there's actually more to follow tomorrow.
Excellent, Kevin. Well done. Okay, let's get started. We are, I know Arthur is there. He doesn't have to come on. He's just shopping. I get it. Gavin, are you with us, sir?
I'm never with you, but I am present.
Perfect. Well,
he's present.
He's present. All right. So listen, I'll tell you where we are. We're at 58.2, and we're dealing with Rav Yosef's interpretation is challenged. Okay, but I think before we do deal with that issue about how he actually is challenged, I think what I'd like to do with you guys is just capture in 1 minute the difference between Rabba and Rav Yosef's opinion. Because if we don't do this, then at the end of the day, you guys are not going to be fully aware as to the nuances of this discussion. Agreed?
Yeah.
All right. I'm just going to share my screen. I think it's an excellent place to start. Okay, and I'm just going to read it aloud because, Arthur, I know you under pressure. You don't have to go on your screen. Just I want you to hear this. That's all. As long as you can hear this, that's fine. But all right. So Rav Yosef's interpretation differs from Rabba's as follows. Rabba stated that Rabbi Akiva holds the digger liable in all circumstances, and Rav Yishmael limits liability to a pit in the public domain. Rav Yosef states that Rav Yishmael holds the digger liable in all instances, and Rabbi Akiva limits liability to pit in the private domain. Okay? Our Mishnah holds the digger liable whether the bore is in his own property or the public thoroughfare, So Rabba understands it as following Rabbi Akiva, whereas Rav Yosef understands it as following Rav Yishmael. And thanks to Rashi, we have that clarity. Okay? That's going to help us a lot, I think. Okay.
We just touched on it yesterday as well.
No, I did, but unless you remembered it from yesterday perfectly, the nuances of this discussion will be lost. So it was worth that minute review. I believe so. I might be wrong. All right. So Rav Yosef's interpretation is challenged. They challenged Rav Yosef from the following brisa. If one digs a pit in the public domain and opens it to his private domain, he is exempt from paying damages incurred by those who fall in it. I'll state this again. This is a challenge to Rav Yosef. Again, Rav Yosef states that Rabbi Yishmael holds the digger liable in all circumstances, guys, and Rabbi Akiva limits liability to the private domain. Okay? With that in mind, this is the challenge to Rav Yosef. If you dig a pit in the public domain and open it up to his private domain, he is exempt from paying damages incurred by those who fall in. Okay? And incurred by those who fall in where? So in other words, the Gemara, there's an explanation by Rashi given here for those that fall in the opening that is on his own property, not with regards not with regards to those that fall into the opening in the public domain. Does that make sense? There's a small opening in the there's a small pit. And what happens is the guy actually created, what do you call it, like a tunnel underneath his property where it's almost like a cave. And then what happens is the public goes past it. But the opening is in his own property. So the brisa would seem to mean that he's exempt even if he renounced ownership of the area around the opening. So the Tana exempts a person for damage by a ball that is in his own domain, even when the public has permission to walk alongside it. However, if a person or animal walking in the public thoroughfare falls through the roof of the pit in the cavity underneath the thoroughfare and is damaged, the digger obviously is certainly liable, because this Tana follows the opinion that you're liable to pay for damage by a bore in the public domain. Okay? So with that in mind, Brisa says if one digs a pit in the public domain and opens it to his private domain, he's exempt from paying for damages incurred by those who fall in, even though one is not allowed to do this because you cannot create a cavity underneath the public domain. If you dig pits, ditches, or vaults in his private domain and he opens them to the public domain, now guys, this case is the opposite way, right? If you dig pits, ditches and vaults in your private domain and open them to the public domain, you're liable to pay for damage that they do. So the Brisa is saying that if your entrance is in the private domain, the opening, you're exempt. If it's in the public domain, you're liable. And if one digs pits in his private domain adjacent to the public domain, for example, as in the case of one who digs foundations for houses, abutting through the public thoroughfare, he's exempt from paying for damage that they do. Why? Because this isn't a cosmetic change. In other words, there's a special dispensation granted for the digging of foundations, because if you don't dig proper foundations, a person's house can cave in on them and the family. So in that case, the digger is liable by the municipality, but just for digging for cosmetic, for a swimming pool purpose, it's not. Okay. So this is what Kevin was talking about foundations yesterday. So he's exempt if you're doing it for foundations. But Rav Yossi, the son of Rav Yehuda, holds the digger liable unless he made a barrier. So how big does this barrier have to be? 10 tefachim high between the excavations and the public thoroughfare. Now, Kevin, do you know how much a tefach is?
A handbreadth.
So, and an amos?
Well, I think it's 15 centimeters. 15, yeah. Amot is half a meter. Amot is half a meter.
Half a meter.
Okay.
Amot is half a meter. Tefach is about 30 centimeters, 15 centimeters, like half a ruler.
Okay.
Yeah. Houses for a prop. Yeah.
Oh wow.
I'll even measure it for you here. Hold on a sec. There's the. Yeah, it's about. This is actually 60. I measure from here. It's just under 60, so it's about 50. 15.
So it's right. The tefach is a handbreadth. It says it's 4 digits. It describes it as 4 digits. It's a handbreadth. Tefach literally means handbreadth, and amos is from your elbow to your wrist.
Half a meter. Yeah.
Well, it's half a meter if you're not a hobbit like me. If you're normal people like Kevin and Gavin, it's a half a meter. For me, I wouldn't call it half a meter. But apparently, if you have to do it 10 tefach, that's 4 fingers breadth times 10. That's not very big, but I suppose it's enough to make you realize that there's a barrier and you're not going to fall into it. It doesn't seem that big. But the original comment, so that's how high it's got to be, okay? Now, there's another possibility. In other words, if you don't want to make a barrier 10 tefachim high between the excavation and the public thoroughfare, you can draw your excavation back from the place where people walk and the place where animal walks, a distance of 4 tefachim. Okay? So that's not a lot. 4 tefachim is basically what? 16 centimeters. How big is it?
15 times. The 15 times the, what do you say, 4?
60 centimeters, just over half a meter.
No, a tefach. A tefach.
You said 4 tefachim.
Yeah.
So 4 times
That's
15.
110. Yeah, so just over half a meter.
Okay, so 4 tefachim is just over half a
one
meter.
amot. Same with almost like an amot. Yeah.
Okay, all right. So that's perfect. So in other words, you can either create 10 amot high to separate the excavation from the place where people walk, or you do a width of 4 tefachim. So the Gemara now is going to develop its challenge. It says in its final clause, the Bryce implies that the reason the digger is exempt is that he dug foundations. But if he didn't dig foundations, he would be liable to pay for damage that excavations caused, even though it's on his own property. Okay? So, because since the excavation guys abuts in the public domain, the digger can't tell the victim, why did your animal walk at its edge? So the case is analogous to one in which a person dug a bore in the center of your domain, and then you renounce ownership of the area around it. That's exactly what it's comparable to. So you can't defend yourself by saying, what are you doing in my property? Because there's a certain amount of it that's still within the public entrance, enough for somebody to fall in, okay? It's obviously different when you're laying a foundation. You're not negligent because you've got a special dispensation. Right. So we want to say that if you didn't dig foundations, you're liable to pay for the damage that the excavation causes if it's cosmetic, like making a swimming pool, even though it's in your own property. But your Bryce's last clause contradicts its first clause, because again, the Bryce says, if you dig a pit in the public domain and open it to the private domain, you're exempt for paying damages incurred by those that fall in. Okay? But in the private domain, if you open them up to the public domain, you're liable for the damage that you do. So in that particular case, we want to know whose opinion does this reflect in each clause of the brisa. All right, so according to Rabbah, everything is fine here. Why? Because Rabbah said that Rav Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva only disagree regarding the status of a bore in your own domain. So this is how you can explain it, guys. You can say the first clause, which exempts a person from liability when he digs in his own property, follows the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Okay? And for the last clause, which implies that unless you're digging it for the purpose of laying a foundation, you're liable, because that follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Because Rabbi Akiva is stating, look, very simply, you are liable in the private domain, and which excavation is an exemption. Does that make sense, guys, why this is not contradictory? Any questions according to Rabbi? That's clear. That's clear. Okay, but the problem is going to be with who? Rav Yosef, because he basically said that you're liable to pay for damage caused by the pit in your own domain. Okay? Everybody agrees that. So all is well with the last clause, which implies that your digger is ordinarily liable. Okay? Unless you're doing foundations. And that reflects opinions of all Tanaim. But the first clause, which exempts the digger of liability if his pit is in his own domain, whose opinion does it represent, guys?
Would you say the pit's in his own domain?
Okay, so look, the last clause is...
Akiva.
Okay, why?
Because it's a private domain.
Okay, and but do you remember what Rav Yosef said?
What about Rabbi Akiva?
Yeah, Rav Yosef.
So, so he said it's the other way around.
Okay.
Rabbi Akiva. So, who's it? Rabbi and Rav Yosef, eh? The Rabbi.
Rabbi and Rav Yosef, yeah.
So Rabbi says that Rabbi follows Rabbi Akiva, and he says, according to Rabbi Akiva, in the private domain you're liable, and in the public domain he says you are as well.
Okay, hang on a second, Gav. I want to ask you a favor. I want you to give over the opinion of Rabbi and Rav Yosef, and that'll clear it up for you guys. What's Rabbi's opinion in terms of Rav Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva?
Because Rabbi said it's not just in the private. Rabbi Akiva is basically in the private domain only, and he says in the public domain you're not responsible. So according to Rabbi, he said
no, that's not true. It's not.
One
true.
of them is.
I'll share the notes. I'll share the notes, guys. Give me 1 second.
Kevin, you go for it. Yeah, I've just got it mixed up. Kevin, go for it.
Yeah, no, one of them is actually says you're liable in all domains, regardless.
Well, they're both
private and public.
They both say that, Kev, according to. So let's just look at the ground rules again, guys. Then it's going to help. I can fly ahead, but it's not going to help until you do it. Okay, Rabbi stated that Rabbi Akiva says you liable in public and private domain. Rabbi Yishmael only in the public domain. Okay? Rav Yosef states that Rabbi Yishmael holds the digger liable in public and private, and Rabbi Akiva in the private domain. Okay. So, with that bearing in mind, it's changed the discussion. So let me just repeat what I was saying, and then it's going to be a little bit clearer for you guys, okay?
You see, Damon, sorry to interrupt you.
Sure.
It confuses. Rabbi says he's saying what Rav Yishmael says and what Rabbi Akiva says, and that's what that actually confuses me. It's like he's stating what their opinion. It's not his opinion. Is he agreeing with them, or is he just stating a fact?
Okay.
You see that? It's a bit confusing. You see that?
It is. So let me answer Kevin's question a sec. So Kevin, when we look at the opening braisa of this Gemara, right? And you, it says, if one digs a pit in his private domain and opens it to the public domain, you're liable to pay for the damage that it does. Okay? And that is the bore that is mentioned in the Torah. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. So Rabbi Yishmael says, if it's opened up, if it's a private domain and it's opened up in the public domain to the public, that's what's mentioned in the Torah. Rabbi Akiva says if you dig a property in your own domain and renounce ownership, but you don't renounce ownership of your pit, you're liable in the private domain. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds similar when you're first sounding it. Why? Because it sounds like Rabbi Yishmael is agreeing with whom? With Rabbi Akiva in one respect. Let me just share my screen and show you what I mean. Sorry, guys.
About the private domain.
Yeah, let me just show you something here. Okay, just give me 1 second. I'm sharing my screen. Okay, Gav, you want to read it?
Sure. A brisa relating to our Mishnah is cited. The rabbi taught in a brisa, if one digs a pit in his private domain and opens it in the public domain, he's liable to pay for damage that he does. And this is the ball that is mentioned in the Torah. These are the words of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva says if one digs a pit in his own domain and renounces ownership of his property around the pit, but does not renounce ownership of the pit itself, so that he owns the pit, but the public has permission to walk up to its lip. This is the ball that is mentioned in the Torah.
Fine. So let's examine this together. When you dig a pit in the private domain and open it up to the public domain, then we can clearly see that Rabbi Yishmael obligates for any damage to the public, yes or no?
Yes.
Fine. So think of Rabbi Yishmael as public domain level of liability. Okay? I'm just giving you an easy way to work it out. Okay? If you're looking at Rabbi Akiva, he now says, you're only renouncing the area around the pit, but you're not renouncing the pit, because it says in the Torah, the owner of the pit, it uses the word, which means it's your private property that's causing the damage. So Rabbi Akiva talks about private property pit. That's the lip or the area surrounding it is open to the public. That's the border that's mentioned in the Torah. So they're diametrically opposed. So what the Gemara wants to ask Kevin is, well, do they agree on anything? That's where Rabbi and Rav Yosef come about, because they're in opposites. What we can see here is Rabbi Yishmael is saying you're liable for public liability, and Rabbi Akiva is saying you're liable for a pit you own. But if you declare the pit ownerless, you're not liable. And whose opinion is this? Do you remember we learned Rav and Shmuel? Do you remember Rav and Shmuel, that whole discussion? That Shmuel says you're liable whether you dug a pit in a private or public domain, you're liable. And Rav said that if it's if you haven't relinquished ownership, it's like your shore. Whereas Shmuel said it's a bore, whether it's public or private. Whether you've renounced ownership or not, it doesn't matter. It's a public hazard. You have to pay. That's Shmuel. Rav turned around and said, no, if you've renounced ownership, it's a bore. But if you haven't renounced ownership, it's like a shore, which means you're obligated for utensils. Where did they get this from? They got it from the Tanaim, Rabbi Akiva and Rav Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael is saying, listen, anything you opened up to the public that damages the public, whether you dug in the public or you dug in your private, but you opened it up to the public for use, you're liable. It's an issue of liability. Rabbi Akiva said it's an issue of ownership. So only something you haven't relinquished that you've done in your property, but you've allowed people around it, you're liable. It's an issue of ownership. And Rav Yishmael said, what are you talking ownership? You don't make money off it. You spend money on it, maybe to make a swimming pool, but you don't make money off it. It's not at the point at which the hole is dug, it's not really a useful proposition. We're saying you have to take ownership responsibility, Kevin, of the damage you've done. That's what Rabbi Yishmael is saying. So the Gemara is saying, hang on a second. Rav Yishmael, public liability. Rabbi Akiva, only the owner of the pit is liable. Okay, or do they agree on anything? Shem Kev, you want to stand up? You're nodding off a little bit.
No, fine. No, not.
You okay? Okay.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is the Gemara wants to know: do they ever agree? Rabbi and Rav Yishmael, Rabbi Akiva and Rav Yishmael, do they ever agree? So that's where Rabbi is coming to say, yes, there are areas they agree. And Rav Yosef is also saying, yes, there's areas they agree. But on what they agree on, their opinion is different. Does that make sense? So what's happening is that basically Rabbi is saying, look, Rabbi Akiva says that the Rabbi is saying that Rabbi Akiva holds the digger liable in all circumstances. Okay? In other words, whether he owns the pit or whether it's in the public. He's liable in all circumstances. That's Rabbi's opinion on Rabbi Akiva. He's saying Rabbi Yishmael only limits liability to the public domain. Why? Because that's most likely that you can't say if somebody's in your own domain that it's your level of responsibility according to Rav Yishmael. What are you doing there? So anything you've allowed opened up to the public is technically a problem. It is a problem. So how does that cover? Well, it covers the fact that if you've allowed them up until that point, public area, you've now created a public hazard. It has nothing to do with ownership. Nothing. Now, it's a slightly different case with Rav Yosef. He states that Rabbi Yishmael holds the digger liable in all circumstances. Why in all circumstances? Because the minute you open up that area surrounding the pit to your property, he's saying, well, the public could be damaged. If you create in the public, it could be damaged. Either way, where the public's allowed to go, I'm saying Rav Yosef is saying you're liable, but Rabbi Akiva is saying only a pit where the owner hasn't relinquished ownership because he sees it as an ownership issue, are you liable? Does that make sense? That's Rav Yosef.
So then is Rabbi saying, sorry, just one thing, is Rabbi saying then that...
Rabbi, not Rabbi.
Sorry. Rabbi in essence is saying that when you dig a pit, because he's saying Rabbi Akiva deems you, according to him, that in both areas you're responsible. So he's saying in the public domain, according to Rabbi Akiva, ownership does take place in the digger pit there. You become the owner. It's not ownerless in the public domain. And that's why he says that because you own that pit in the public domain, that's why he says, Rabbi Akiva says you're liable in both domains.
Yeah, because basically how Rabbi's interpreting it is from that verse. Do you remember there was that verse in Exodus? Let me just see if I can find it, guys. Just give me a second.
21, 22 or something. Yeah.
Oh, very good, man.
Excellent.
No, but I'm not on your level, Gavin. I'm lagging behind you tonight. Don't get too excited.
That's it. You haven't had a cup of coffee. I had a cup of coffee earlier. See, that's why.
I didn't.
You see?
I should have, maybe. It's fine.
You're very bright eyed. You stay awake.
Yeah.
You know, you're a bright guy.
No, I'm bright.
If you were sitting in a pit.
No, I'm not bright. I'm bright, Damon.
No one would fall.
No, I'm bright.
Now you're brighter, that's for sure. But there was nothing wrong with
that, Damon.
Well, depends which brighter you're looking at, but you're right.
It depends which price you're looking at, exactly. So basically, this issue is as follows, is that there was that verse, just sharing my screen.
So David, so it's basically based on ownership. Is that what the argument is about?
Well, according to Rabbi Akiva, yes. Because it says, the owner of the pit shall make restitution.
Yeah.
So in other words, I think Rabbi Yishmael's issue is the fact of it, it's about taking ownership responsibility. And in the public, the question to Rabbi Akiva, which I'm sure he has an answer to, I just don't know enough Tosfots and Rashi, is how do you own land that is in the public domain? Everybody owns it. It's not specifically owned by you.
I think what happens I think the way he looks at it, I'm guessing, but this is my gut feel, is that when you build that pit, you take ownership. You become the owner of the actual pit itself. Even in the public domain, until you fill it up or until you relinquish ownership.
According to Rabba, I suppose. According to Rabba, yeah.
Yeah. So that's how you get far in the public domain.
Okay, so it makes sense. Let's go to the actual question in the Gemara.
According to the other one, not according to Rabba. Rabba's going.
According to Rabba. Because, hang on, Gav, just let me finish a sentence a sec, but Rabba says that Rabbi Akiva holds the digger liable in all instances.
Correct. So that's correct. And then that's Rabbi Akiva agrees. So he's definitely ownership of the actual, you can't own the land, but you own that actual pit. I agree. That's Rabbi Akiva. And then the other guy that's arguing, who's the other guy? Rabbi Ishmael.
This is the argument according to Rabba. This is not Rav Yosef's argument. Rabbi Ishmael says you're only liable in the public area.
Yeah, so when he's saying you're only liable in the public area, the way he's looking at that verse, the source is that you're not the owner of the land, but you're the owner of that pit as well. That's how he's looking at it. And you need to take ownership of that pit. So he's looking at it from both those.
No, well, he's looking at it a case of damage as liability. That's what the Gemara said. Is that he's saying you own the hazard. You created the situation, actually. Yeah, exactly. All right. So let's just go through what the issue is with the Gemara because it didn't seem so clear. So let's just go through it a second, okay? The Gemara develops its challenge. In its final clause, the Bryce implies that the reason the digger is exempt is that he dug foundations. But if he didn't dig foundations, he would be liable to pay for the damage that the excavation causes, even though it's in his own property. Thus, the Bryce's last clause contradicts its first clause. Whereas the first clause exempts a person of liability for damage by pitting that is in his own domain, the last clause implies that he's liable unless he dug it in order to lay a foundation. Now, whose opinion is reflected of each clause of this brisa? So it's saying, listen, the Gemara is saying all is well according to Rabbah. Because according to Rabbah, Rav Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva only disagree regarding the status of a bore in one's own domain, in your private domain. And you can explain that the first clause, which exempts a person from liability, is when he digs in his own property. That's according to Rabbi Ishmael. And the last clause, which implies that unless he digs for the purposes of foundation, he's liable, and that follows the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. So we're cool with Rabbah. Okay? Rav Yosef poses the problem here according to the challenge to this brisa. Why? Because he said that all agree that one is liable to pay for damage caused by pit in his own domain. Why do we say that, Gavin? We say that because Rav Yosef states that Rav Yishmael holds the digger liable in all circumstances, and Rabbi Akiva limits liability to a pit in the private domain. So it's saying, if you look at Rav Yosef, okay, who agree that one is liable to pay for damage caused by a pit in your own domain, all is well with the last clause, because it implies that the digger is ordinarily liable, and it reflects the opinion of all the Tanaim. But now you've got a problem with the first clause, because it exempts the digger of liability for the pit in his own domain. So if it exempts the digger of the liability for his pit in his own domain, Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, according to Rav Yosef, says you're liable for a pit that you create in your own domain. Does that make sense? That's the problem. Am I making sense, guys?
Yeah.
Okay. Hang on a second. No, there's an error here. Just give me a second. I'll tell you what the error is. Sorry, Gavin. I owe you an apology. I said it in the wrong way. Apologies. Let me just say it in the right way. So Rav Yosef holds Rabbi Ishmael liable in all circumstances, Rabbi Akiva only in the private domain. Okay? So the last clause which means that they both hold liability in terms of the private domain. That does follow
both Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I'll tell you why. There's an issue. Let me just share the screen. There is a bit of an issue. Just give me a sec. Sorry, guys. Just give me 1 second here. Apologize, guys. I just want to make sure I haven't left anything out. Just give me a second.
Take the time. It's by Tuesday before Kevin goes to Israel.
Gav, you can only throw a stone when you clearer than me. If we both out of it. All right. Let me just share the screen here. All right, guys, I'm going to share the screen. All right, Gavin, it makes sense. Let me just clarify this, right? But according to Rav Yosef, read that.
But according to Rav Yosef, he said that all agree that one is liable to pay for damage caused in a pit in his own domain. All is well with the last clause, which implies that the digger is ordinarily liable, which reflects the opinion of all Tanaim. But as far as the first clause, which exempts the digger of liability when the pit is in his own domain, whose opinion does it represent? It is either the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, it is neither the opinion, that's interesting, of Rabbi Yishmael nor that of Rabbi Akiva.
Correct. You know why?
Because they say you are liable.
Correct.
So this is the opposite of them.
Correct.
So this is Arthur's good at this. He's good with the opposite opinion. Arthur, take over. All right. Explain to us.
Very fun. All right. So it's straightforward now. So basically, this brisa says that why would you be exempted? It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. Why? Because according to Rav Yosef, Rabbi Yishmael says you're responsible in all instances, and Rabbi Akiva only in the private domain. So Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva both admit in the private domain you're liable. So this says you're exempted in the private domain. Exactly, Gavin. So now there's a problem. So the Gemara answers, Rav Yosef can tell you the entire brisa is actually the opinion of all Tanaim. The first clause, which exempts the digger, deals with the case where he did not renounce ownership of either his domain or the pit. Rather, he dug a pit in the middle of his own property and did not grant the public permission to walk nearby. And accordingly, if somebody enters the property and falls into the pit, the owner can't be held liable, for he can tell the victim, why did you trespass? The last clause then teaches that in a case where the public does have permission to walk alongside the pit, the digger is liable. So having resolved the challenge to Rav Yosef, the Gemara returns to Rabba's view. Rav Ashi said, now that you've interpreted the brisa according to Rav Yosef as following the opinion of all Tanaim, according to Rabba too, you should not interpret it as reflecting a Tanaic dispute with the first clause following Rabbi Yishmael and the last clause following Rabbi Akiva suggested above. Rather, since the first clause follows the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, who exempts a person of liability when he digs a pit in his own property, it behooves us to interpret the last clause too and follow the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. As for the inference, for the reason that the digger is exempt, is that he dug foundations. But if he would not dig foundations, he would be liable for the explanation as follows. We're dealing with a case where the digger widened the excavation beyond the edge of his own property into the public domain. Since his hole is actually in the public domain, he's exempt only if he dug it for the purpose of laying a foundation. In other words, you can, if you're laying a foundation, go within the public domain to a certain extent, because the foundation has to be bigger than the house that you make, because you need to use a bit of the adjacent public property, okay, and therefore you're exempt of liability. So that's as far as Rashi is concerned, okay. And let's just cover ground for a few minutes, and then we're done. Another challenge to Rav Yosef is cited. They challenged Rav Yosef from the following brisa. If one digs a pit in his private domain and opens it to the public domain, he is liable to pay for damage that it does. If you dig in his private domain adjacent to the public domain, he's exempt from liability. All is well according to Rabba, who said that Rabbi Yishmael holds a person liable only when he digs in the public domain, but not when he digs in the private domain. For accordingly, the entire brisa is the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. But according to Rav Yosef, who says that Rabbi Yishmael holds a person liable in all cases, and Rabbi Akiva holds him liable only when the pit is in the private domain, all is well with the first clause, which holds the person liable when the pit is in the public domain. For it follows the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. For the latter clause, which exempts the person when the pit is in his private domain, whose opinion does it represent? It is neither the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael nor that of Rabbi Akiva. So, Gavin, this is the same argument reasserting itself with a different brisa. And in the Gemara answers, Rav Yosef will say to you, what do you think his answer will be, guys? Why is there an exception in this case?
Because of the foundation.
Exactly. The latter clause deals with a case where one digs foundations, and it accords with the opinion of all Tanaim. For all agree in this case is exempt of liability. Okay?
So Rabbi and Rabbi Yishmael both agree that if it's foundation, you also...
Yes, that's irrespective of whether you go with Rav Yosef's opinion or Rabba's opinion, because the one was foundations edging into the public, and then one was foundations within your own property, at which Rabbi Akiva would hold you liable anyway. Does that make sense? So in either way, foundations are the exemption. We're almost there. So a brisa discusses another case in which somebody digs a pit in the public domain is exempt of liability. Now, I'll tell you what, I think we can stop at this point. I think we've done a reasonable amount. What do you think, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, Damon.
Yeah?
I'll make it.
Is the reason why the foundation, if the pit is for the purpose of being for a foundation, it's for a constructive purpose. Is that the reason why there's an exemption? What's the reason why?
Okay, it's not the reason, because one could say that building a swimming pool is for a constructive purpose. The reality is it's for a safety purpose. If you do not create foundations when you're creating a house, Jeff Kaplan was a civil engineer. He showed me how there's tectonic plate shifting, how you have to create spacing between the bricks, how you have expansion and contraction with heat. Because he built the house, he was involved with building the house and adding on rooms for the kids or whatever. He was a civil engineer. He qualified as a civil engineer, even though he ended up in diamonds. And if your foundations aren't right, that in a building, it's lethal. In a house, it could be lethal. So there, the public has to understand, although I'm sure the rules would apply, that from what I saw in the commentary is that there are certain things that you have to let the town know. Like we're going to discuss a case when you build a cistern and you offer it to the public. You have to let the authority bodies, the municipal bodies know. You need to have a town consensus. If the town doesn't want it, you need to then removes the hazard. So you have to go through certain checks and balances, reputable company, signage, awareness, notifications, the normal drill. On-site notifications and press notifications or whatever they had.
And it's also the foundation is going to be filled. If it's a foundation, it's just temporary. It will eventually be filled with cement or concrete.
So what I understood from the Gemara is the foundations that they did in those days were not like the foundations now. They had to make the foundations bigger. So I don't know if you know, with the pyramid, is one of the strongest buildings, not like a high-rise building, because it's not liable to sway. Your biggest foundations give you the biggest security. So in those days, the foundations were bigger than the house. The baseline was bigger than the property. That's why it would go within the public domain. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
it could protrude into the public domain. Yeah,
absolutely.
From private to public.
Then, and I didn't read all the notes. I'm not 100% sure if it was there, but you have spoken about it. It would have been properly demarcated, like you say. It would have been announced in the town and the mayor, whatever. It would have been, everybody more or less would have known about it. But obviously, lower level people, just regular people, might not have been informed. So I'm sure they would have put hazards. You know that they do, yeah. If you walk past the construction,
yes.
Obviously it's more sophisticated.
And that's why Rav Yossi, the son of Rav Yehuda, says that the digger is liable unless you make a barrier 10 tefachim high between his excavation and the public thoroughfare, or unless he draws his excavation back from the place where people walk and the place where animals walk a distance of 4 tefachim. Agreed. Absolutely agreed.
That's what I talk about. Yeah, that's right. You did talk about it. Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect, guys. Listen, I think you've done very well. I don't want to drag it out more than we have to.
Damon, that is well constructed by you, Damon.
Thank you. I'm sorry for the slight dodginess in the 1 point. Sorry, guys, honestly.
No, but it's confusing with like Rabbi says, he states the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. It's not his own, you know what I mean? It's like, makes it. He's not giving his own opinion. His opinion is what Rabbi Akiva's opinion.
Do you know why he gives the opinion? Because
that's a bit strange. Yeah.
No, it's not. Yeah. It's not when you understand how it was constructed. Firstly, there were 5 generations of Tanaim. 5 generations. Then you had the Amoraim.
Yeah.
And the thing of it is, you had many generations of Amoraim as well after that. Then you had the Rishonim, etc. So they're all explaining what they learned in their specific Talmudic schools. And they're building blocks of what they learned from their teachers. So we don't have Rabbi Akiva himself being able to tell the later generations, or Rabbi Ishmael, what their opinion is. So you have to learn from the books, and the person of that generation's explaining it, because they're still leaders to us, because they are Amoraim.
Yeah, they're much. If we look, it's like us looking at this and trying to work it out. These guys are a million times higher level than any of us. So when they're analyzing Rabbi Akiva, they're not quite Rabbi Akiva's level, but they're not far behind, type of thing. You know, we miles behind. You know,
light years.
Light years. So that's why, Kevin, they're quoting. It's saying Rabbi is quoting the opinion of Rav.
So from where their school they learned in that academy. Is that
yes, exactly.
So they adopted it. Is that what they? Okay.
These main guys that came up.
You knew that. Gavin knew that, because Gavin's a very highly. You knew that. Gavin didn't. What he explained it to me. You knew that. Damon had to explain it to me now. You did know that. Arthur taught it to Damon, maybe. Okay.
We were talking about that this needs to be well constructed, and this is the foundation for everything. How's that?
And as long as he doesn't deconstruct anything he said tonight, Arthur.
Yeah, and just don't dig it. Just don't dig this.
Did you, Arthur? Did you dig the shit, Arthur?
I'm going to take my nausea. Did you dig the shit? Yeah, I'm going to take my nausea pools now.
Guys,
sure.
Stop taking everything apart.
And now I'm going to go to the public domain and dig the shore even more.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, guys, we're talking absolute nonsense.
No, but
go.
it's, we're
But
playing
we
with
can.
words. It's good.
We're gonna edit the share, the difference between the public share and the private share.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, a public share is a share that you upload to YouTube.
Yeah, and the
That's a
private
public
share, and you liable for only the public share opinion.
A private share is in real time, like now.
In Shemaim, you liable for that. All right. Cheers, guys.
Ah,